Hey guys, it is finally that time of year, and it is time to begin our coverage of Big Brother 27 with a preseason power ranking. In this video, I'll be ranking all the house guests based on how lucky I think they are to win the game based off my first impressions of them. And I feel like generally speaking, this is a pretty standard Big Brother cast where I feel like there aren't that many unconventional picks. I feel like this is kind of a step down compared to seasons 25 and 26. If I'm being perfectly honest, I feel like there aren't that many people I'm that excited about. And I also noticed that this was a very young skewing cast as well, where there's a lot of people in their 20s and early 30s. And I believe there are only 2 people over the age of 40 on this cast, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, but that's just where we are at this point. And one other thing I wanted to mention is I will not be speculating too much about the mystery house cast that has been floating around social media. I'll just be looking at the 16 people that we know are going to be on the season. But with all that out of the way, I'll be ranking all these people based on how good I feel about them to actually win the game, based purely off their bios and their preseason interviews, which admittedly don't reveal that much, but still, it's all we have. But there are 16 people to talk about, and let's waste some more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 16, the person I believe is the least likely to win coming into the season is Kelly. And again, I feel like this is largely based off first impressions and the limited information that we currently have. But I feel like based on the information we currently have, I would say Kelly's probably the most likely person to be an early boot in my personal opinion, where I don't get the greatest sense that she's that strong socially, where I feel like she came off a bit meek and kind of awkward in her interview. And even beyond that, I wasn't really that impressed by her answers as well, where she talks about how she's going to be bad at comps and how she's pretty clumsy. And while she does talk about how like her biggest strength is her social skills and her ability to read people, I'm not getting the greatest sense that she's going to connect well with a lot of people within the house. She also talks about how her plans to kill everyone with kindness and how she's going to bring this weird, quirky energy to the house and how she wants to lay low with her first few weeks and hopefully make jury. I'm just not feeling the greatest about Kelly, and while there's a chance that she could slip on through the early rounds to her being this non-threat, I could also very easily see her being like this relatively early target that no one cares about that much. And again, while this is based purely off limited information, I feel like based on what we currently have, Kelly's the person that I have the least confidence in at this current point, which is why she's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have yet another person who I could definitely see being an early boot, but even if they were to make it further, I don't really see them as a very likely winner either. But number 15, we do have Ava. And Ava is a pretty interesting personality where she is an aura painter, which I didn't know that was a thing until now. And again, I think Ava's someone who definitely has some red flags in her interview where she talks about how her biggest weakness is her emotions getting the better of her and how she likes to tell it like it is and how she doesn't take crap from others, which I could definitely see her getting into confrontations with other people. I could definitely see her getting in trouble because of that. And while she does talk about how she's good at reading people and how she can sense their auras and stuff, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to translate to her, like, enacting strategy in the game. I don't get the greatest sense that she knows the game super well. She even says herself that she only got into the show to connect more with her brother. And then on top of that, I feel like she is a bit on the younger side at 24, which, to be fair, there are definitely people that are younger than her on this cast. And this is obviously a very young skewing cast. But I feel like with her being on the younger side of things and not having as much life experience, I could definitely see that being a hindrance to her as well, which mixing in the other flaws that she already has. I feel like Ava's someone who definitely has a lot of potential to be an early boo, as someone who gets into confrontation, someone who could just like not connect well with the rest of the house. But even if she were to make it deeper into the game, I can't really see her being this big player that's able to go on to actually win the game or garner respect from a lot of the housemates. So it's for that reason that I can't really have her too much higher than number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we're jumping from one of the younger people on the cast to the oldest person, and here we have Will. And Will is the oldest person here at 50 years old, which is kind of sad when you think about that he's the oldest person here. And I think Will definitely has more upside than the people we already talked about, where he actually is a pretty charismatic person, where I feel like he has a lot of energy in his interview. And I feel like he definitely has like this game plan of trying to play this bigger game and to subvert expectations about him being the older person. But at the end of the day, I feel like Will is someone I'm not feeling the greatest about, where even though he does talk about how he wants to like play this big game, how he wants to build his alliance right off the bat, how he wants to manipulate and be the puppet master, I just don't think this cast is going to allow someone like Will to do that. And I could definitely see him flaming out early because of that, where he does talk about having like this pretty set game plan of getting like 4 people together, with him having an older person, a comp piece, and a strategist. And to be fair, it's good that he recognizes that, but I could also see him like getting caught in sort of overestimating his abilities where I just can't really imagine someone like Will holding power for too long in the game. And even on that, he talks about how he may be a know-it-all, but has to temper that down. So I definitely see him getting into confrontations and him just overestimating his abilities in the house. Though to be fair, I could definitely see him being like a shield as well, someone who may have some influence in the short term, but eventually like lose that control. I feel like Will is someone who has the upside of someone who wants to play a bigger game, and I could definitely see it working in the short term for him. But at the end of the day, I feel like he'll eventually get caught. I feel like he'll eventually like lose steam, and people will eventually get fed up with him. Or on the other hand, he just flames out right away and just doesn't really have much traction in the game. So I feel like Will is someone who I definitely like, and he'll definitely be fun to watch, but I feel like it's just not going to translate that well to the actual game, which is why he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have the second oldest person on the cast, and here we have Amy. And Amy to me feels very Angela coded, where she is obviously the oldest woman on the cast at 43, which again, it's sad that she is the oldest at just 43. And I feel like the way that she talks to her interview, like, makes me feel like she's primed to be like this Angela figure, where right at the bat, she talks about how she wants to create this women's alliance and target all the men, which makes me think that she's going to be very chaotic in the first week and trying to get this plan together, trying to rally the women. And through that, I would expect her to get into a lot of conflict early on, which could definitely lead to some intrigue there. Though beyond that, she also talks about how like her secret weapon is how people love her, how she seems to be like this girl's girl and a lover, which also feeds into like this Angela persona of someone who thinks of herself as this very like good person, which I think is pretty interesting there. I feel like Amy definitely has a lot of potential to be like this Angela figure, which obviously is good from an entertainment standpoint, but not so good from a game standpoint. So I feel like for those reasons, I feel like it's hard for me to see how Amy actually does well in the game, where obviously she does want to like have this woman's alliance together, which who knows how serious she'll actually be with that when she's actually in the house. But I feel like the fact that that's her plan coming into the game and that's her approach to things obviously is something that will obviously either work in the short term or will just blow up right away. So I'm not feeling great about her because of that. And on top of that, the fact that she reminds me so much of Angela and the fact that she is like this outlier in the cast of being one of the older people there, I feel like it's for all those reasons that I'm not feeling great about Amy to do well in the long term, but it's the fact that she's at least going to be a bigger player. And I could at least see her like being kept around the short term as well. That makes me feel a little bit higher about her, but at the end of the day, not feeling great in the overall sense, which is why she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we're moving on now to some people who I can definitely see making deeper runs on their season, but will probably not be big factors in the grand scheme of things. But at number 12, we do have Riley, and Riley was pretty boring if I'm being perfectly honest, where despite him being like this professional bull rider and someone who's meant to be like this cowboy style of figure, he's just kind of bland if I'm being honest. I feel like he didn't really give the greatest answers in his interview, where he was just pretty monotone for a lot of it. And even his strategy of like him talking about how he needs to be a follower and go with the flow in the game, I just don't get the greatest sense that he's going to be a big player on the season. And I feel like in general, like he's someone who I feel like will be pretty passive and will just be a number for whatever group he's pulled into. Though with that said, I don't really see a reason to get rid of Riley early either, unless he's like this backdoor plan or like the surprise blindside. But in general, I feel like Riley is someone who's probably not going to be a big player in the season. He didn't really scream out as a gamer in my eyes. I feel like he's just going to be there for the ride for a lot of it. And I feel like there isn't that much upside to him actually winning the season. But the reason he's at least this high is that I feel like there's less of a chance it goes out early, where, like I said, unless there's like this like blindside or unless he just really fails to connect with anyone in the house, I would expect Riley to make it at least a little bit into the game. And I feel like there isn't really much reason to get rid of him. And with him seeming to be competent enough in competitions, I feel like that's enough to have him at least this high on the list. But it's the fact that he doesn't seem to know the game super well, and the fact that he doesn't seem to be that active in how he wants to approach the game. I feel like those are big enough knocks to where I do have to leave him behind here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we kind of have a similar person, but I think this person has a little more upside, and that person is Keanu. And Keanu is sort of in similar mold to Riley, where I don't get the greatest sense that he's going to be an active player in the house, where it seems like he talks a lot about how like people tend to underestimate him, and he doesn't really talk too much about how he's going to enact much strategy across a lot of the season. And I feel like he's just gonna vibe for a lot of the season. I don't think he's gonna like be actively like putting plans together, which is obviously an issue there. He even compares himself to Enzo, which I think was an interesting comparison there. But at the same time, like I think Keanu is someone who sort of similar to Riley will integrate well within the house. I don't really see a reason to get rid of Keanu early, where again, he seems to be built for competitions. I feel like he'll be an asset for the majority alliance to win comps. I feel like beyond that, he seems to be a pretty chill guy as well. So I don't think he's going to cause a lot of conflict in the house. And again, I think he definitely has like this ability to connect with people that makes me feel a bit better about him compared to Riley, where I feel like Riley has a bit more of a chance to be sniped out of the game early. I feel like Keanu is probably a bit more likely to sneak through more of the game. And I feel like it's because of that I have him one spot higher. But at the end of the day, I still feel like he's going to be a mostly passive player. He didn't really scream out to me as someone who's going to be playing that hard, which is why he is here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we're moving on now to a grouping of people who I think are pretty high variance, where I feel like there's definitely some upside to be had with these people, but there's also plenty of red flags that make me hesitate with having them higher. By number 10, we do have Adrien. And Adrien's someone who I kind of want to have higher, as he is like this massive super fan. And he talks so much in his interview about how he's been preparing for this, how he's been practicing competitions, how he's been making slop and sleeping on the floor and like doing all this stuff. And again, I feel like you can clearly tell that he is passionate about the game. And I feel like he talks about the game in a very intelligent way, where he talks about how like the social game and strategic game are interconnected. He talks about how you would like to win the first HOH, so you can set up the power structure. You talk about how the game is in stages and how like you want to stack the jury to take out the comp beast before the final 6. I think there's definitely a lot there with Adrien and definitely a lot of upside. But despite all of that, I just don't think it's going to work out for him, where, for one, I feel like he's way too overconfident, where he's already declaring himself the greatest Big Brother player ever and saying that he's going to be better than Dan, Derek, and Dr. Will, which is obviously a lot there and obviously not great where you're that confident right off the bat. But beyond that, I feel like he didn't come off the greatest in his interview either, where I feel like he came off kind of awkward in his interview. And while I could chalk some of that up to nerves, I could also see Adrien like struggling to connect with people right off the bat, where I could definitely see people being turned off by him and being seen as like this big player and someone who's just way too eager to start playing the game right off the bat. Sort of similar to like a Jacob Derwin from Survivor Ghost Island, for example. I definitely worry for Adrien in that regard. And again, I think short term, I definitely worry a lot about Adrien's ability to actually connect with people and to enact what he wants to put in place. Though with that said, I feel like if he's able to get past like those early impressions of him and is able to build these connections, I think Adrien is someone who definitely would know what to do. I think Adrien could definitely perceive his position in the house and adjust accordingly. So I feel like Adrien's someone who I feel like has the knowledge to know what he should be doing. And I feel like if he's able to get into a good enough position, I feel like he definitely has some legs to work within the game. But at the same time, I just worry about how much he's going to gel within the house and whether he's just going to be like another Joseph from BB26, for example. So it's for that reason that I can't have him too much higher. But it's the fact that he has this much game knowledge and has the potential to play a good game is what leaves him here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have yet another person who I could definitely see being all over the board. By number 9, we do have Zach. And Zach is such a weird person to assess here, where I think he definitely gives off like recruit vibes, where unlike Adrien, I feel like Zach is someone who doesn't really know the show that well, and considering that he like mainly uses BB26 to refer to examples, I get the sense that he's someone who probably only saw the most recent couple seasons, which again, I feel like compared to Adrien is definitely not there. But beyond that, I feel like he gives some pretty weird answers in his interview. Like for one, he talks about how he plans to wait until week 2 to start building alliances, how he wants to lay low and like manage his threat level. But then he talks about how he admires Tucker for flipping the house upside down and just being like a chaotic presence. He also talks about how his biggest strength is his confidence and being an instigator, but says that could also be his biggest weakness. So again, I feel like there's definitely a lot of mixed signals here when it comes to Zach. And I could definitely see a world where he ends up being like a Matt from BB26 or a Tucker as he aspires to be, as someone who ends up like playing like a game that gives off very mixed signals and ends up making himself a target and really just overplays by the end of it. And someone who doesn't really know the game as well as much as you would think. So I feel like those things are definitely big red flags when it comes to Zach. And again, I feel like those things aren't great, but at the same time, he definitely still has like the inherent upsides of being this more athletic guy, someone who, if he's able to lay low, as he says, should be fine in the short term. And unless he gets like a bad first HOH result, like an Amy, for example, should be fine for the short term at least. It's just a question of whether like he'll end up like overplaying or not, and whether like him laying too low could come back to bite him and leave on the outs. So I definitely think there are worry signs for Zach here, and definitely an argument for him being even lower than what he already is. But at the end of the day, I feel like he's still someone who has some upside in the game due to him like being like this inherently athletic guy, and someone who I think if he is to get into a good position should be fine for the short term. I feel like those things were enough to where I did decide to leave him a little bit higher, but not too much higher than number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have yet another person sort of similar to Zach, in someone who I could definitely see going either way. But number 8, we do have Zay. And I think Zay is someone who I'm also not sure what to make of, where I think on one hand, he gives us some good enough answers where he talks about how like his secret weapon is adaptability, how having a set plan coming in is bad, how he doesn't want to showmance and wants to keep his eyes on the prize, and how he doesn't want to win too many competitions early on and make himself a target. Again, I think there's definitely some positives here when it comes to Zay, and I think if he's able to enact some of this stuff, he should be fine to make a deep run. But on the other hand, I think Zay, oddly enough, reminds me of Tucker from last season, where it's funny how Zach is the one who compares himself to Tucker and how he wants to play like him. But I feel like Zay reminds me a lot of how I felt about Tucker in the preseason, where I feel like Tucker is someone who gave up pretty good answers in his interview and came off as this person who you wouldn't expect based on first impressions. But then he got into the house and wasn't really able to put it all together. I feel like Zay is someone who definitely has the potential to have a similar fate here, where despite him giving off these pretty intelligent answers across his interview and coming off as this perceptive player, he does at the same time talk about how he wants to be like this fierce competitor and win a ton of comps anyway, not to mention the fact that he's again on the younger side at 23. So I feel like those things definitely give off some red flags here, and Zay comes into the house and essentially becomes like a Tucker 2.0. So I feel like those things are enough to give me pause with having him higher. But again, the reason he is at least this high is I feel like he is the type of person who, if he is able to be in the majority alliance early on, he should be fine for a lot of the game and is someone who can win a ton of comps anyway. So I feel like it's for that reason that I can't have him too much lower than here, but I feel like there's enough red flags to where I can't have him any higher than number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we're going now to a pretty safe pick, someone who I would expect to make it pretty deep into the season, but also not someone who I think has much upside to actually win. But number 7, we do have Catherine. And Catherine to me feels like a pretty stereotypical Big Brother choice as well, where she is someone who is pretty young at 23, but also someone who seems social enough to where she should have no problems getting to the majority alliance, where she talked about being a waitress and how like she has a degree in public relations, someone who definitely seems to be pretty good socially and someone who I can definitely see like being in the majority of the house for a lot of the season. But at the same time, like I don't really see her like making that big of a move across a lot of the season as well, where she talks about how her plan is to be underestimated and come off as the ditzy girl, but is able to get through because of that. And I feel like we've seen this before with people like Alyssa from BB24 or even Leah from last season, of someone who is able to enact the strategy effectively and is able to get towards the mid game, but doesn't really have much room to actually get towards the end of the game and probably isn't garnering that much respect along the way anyway. And I very much worry that Catherine's going to have a similar fate here of someone who is just going to be a number for the majority group, get to the mid game, and then just be cut at some point because of that. So I do worry for her in that regard, and I don't really have a ton of confidence in her to enact the strategy she wants to go through with. But at the same time, like she is someone who is social enough. Like I don't think there are any red flags that would make me think of her as an early boot per se. But at the same time, I'm just not confident she's going to have the gusto to make the moves necessary to win the game, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I'm feeling okay about right now, though I'm not entirely sure if they have it in them to actually win the game. But number 6, we do have Mickey, and Mickey is a pretty interesting prospect as well here, where I really liked her across her interview. I feel like she came off like as very energetic and someone who I can definitely see people gravitating towards a lot early on. And again, I think there's a lot to like because of that. Though with that said, I think there are definitely some issues to be had here where, for one, she admits that she is not a super fan. She says that she only got into the show during BB24. And through that, I definitely question how much she actually knows about the actual game here. And beyond that, she also talks about as well about how her biggest weakness is being emotional and how she calls herself a crybaby. So again, obviously not the greatest stuff here, but I still think there are positives where she talks about how her biggest strength is her charm. She wants to hold back in competitions early on and how she does have this athletic background. So I feel like that's pretty good. I think there's definitely a lot to like here with Mickey, and I could definitely see her like getting to the majority group. And I could definitely see her like, if she does know the game at least, to eventually like, again, like build something for herself. But I feel like it's that question mark about how well she actually knows the game that makes me hesitate with having her any higher than number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is actually someone who I had pegged as my winner pick when I first saw the cast pictures and when I first glanced at the interviews, but I feel like after thinking about it more and after like reading in more detail, I decided to hold back to a degree. But number 5, we do have Lauren. And Lauren is someone who I really like. I think she is, for one, a massive super fan. She knows the game very well. And I feel like she's someone who I would have a lot of faith in to know what her optimal move is. So I feel like that's pretty good. She talks about how she doesn't want to reveal her super fan status. She also talks about how she's very competitive and is someone who's good at connecting with a lot of people. I think those are all pretty good things here. And I would expect Lauren to have like that upside of being like this person who knows the game pretty well and is able to navigate because of that. But at the same time, like the more that I thought about it, I definitely noticed some more red flags where, for one, she talks about how she's a bad liar, which I feel like is definitely an issue to be had here. Even beyond that, she's also the youngest person on the cast at 22, which again, even though this is like a young skewing cast and she isn't that big of an outlier, I feel like that lack of life experience will definitely be an issue with Lauren in the game. And I think through seeing her in her interview as well, I could also see a lot of potential for her to be like America from BB25, someone who is like this super fan, someone who does have this competitive streak, but is someone who also like struggled to gain capital in the game. And I do worry that Lauren could be like the next coming of America. That could definitely leave her behind. So I feel like after assessing her a bit more, I feel like there's enough issues with her to where I couldn't have her as my winner pick, but I still think there's enough upside there to where I do have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, we have yet another super fan on the board, and here we have Vince. And Vince is another pretty interesting person where I know a lot of people are comparing him to Dr. Eggman based off his appearance, and obviously Vince stands out in a lot of regards here where he definitely gives off like this big player energy with the way that he talks across the interview, and he definitely seems like someone who is poised to like want to be like one of the bigger players in the house. And obviously that can go one of two ways, where on one hand, he could like be very effective in like galvanizing the alliance together and through that play a pretty strong game, but also someone who could eventually like get too far out in front, or someone to Quinn from last season, or even Corey from BB25. So I do feel like there's definitely some downsides there to be had with Vince, and I feel like that's definitely something that's keeping me from having him higher on the board. But at the same time, I still feel like he gave up pretty strong answers in his interview, how his strategy is to take things 1 week at a time, how he wants to like enact his self-awareness in the game. Talked a lot about that in his interview. He talks about how like he wants to like be an open book coming in, doesn't want to have any secrets. Like again, I think there's definitely some good things to be had with Vince, and I would expect him to vibe well with a lot of the house. Though at the same time, I do also see a world where he could like come off as a bit threatening as well. That could like hamper his social capital, but I feel like in general, Vince is someone who I feel pretty good about, and it's for that reason that I have him here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone pretty similar to Vince, if I'm being perfectly honest. And number 3, we do have Jimmy, who I think is another person who has the potential to be like this pretty big player in the house. Another person who's been watching the show for a while, though Jimmy doesn't consider himself a super fan. Though he does also say he has a strategic background as an AI consultant, which sure, I guess. Though again, Jimmy also gives a lot of good answers in his interview, talking about how he has a smarts, a social game, can win comps. He talks about how he's had to build his confidence and build new networks by moving around to different places. Also talks about how he wants to like enact the strategy, being part of this big onion alliance, but also positioning himself well within the alliance by building trios. And I feel like he came off well enough in his interview to where I would expect him to connect well with a decent amount of the house. And in general, I feel pretty good about Jimmy coming into the season. Though with that said, I still worry about him like in terms of like his long-term prospects, where even though he is someone who I would expect to be pretty well positioned early on, I could see him being a bigger target later on in the game. And beyond that, like he is still like kind of on the younger side of things at 25. So I think it's for that reason that I couldn't really have him as my winner pick, though he was definitely a consideration for me. So it's for that reason that he is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I did have a debate here over where I wanted to approach this. in terms of my winner pick, as I feel like pretty good about these two players, albeit for different reasons. However, at number 2, I did decide to go with Ashley. And Ashley's someone who I feel pretty strong about. I feel like in a lot of ways she reminds me a lot of Chelsea from last season, which is obviously a good comparison to be had. She's obviously an attorney, someone who is a pretty big super fan, having watched the show since she was a kid. She also talks about how like people think she'll be like this cute girl when she's really a competitor. Talks about how like she's pretty athletic, how she did track early in life. I feel like there's a lot to like here with Ashley, and I feel like she came off pretty well in her interview to where I feel like she'll be a pretty good social presence within the house, but also someone who is good at the other aspects of the game that could make her this pretty dangerous player in the house. And I did initially have her as my winner pick when I was first putting this list together. Though after thinking about it, I did decide to leave her here number 2. One, because she was still a bit on the younger side at 25, which, again, not the worst in the world, but I feel like still is worth mentioning, like the fact that she doesn't have the most life experience. And on top of that, I think the fact that she is similar to Chelsea and definitely gives out that vibe could make her a target early on. I could definitely see a world where people can compare her to Chelsea and in turn like want to target her because of that. So I think it was those things that gave me a little bit of pause with having her as my winner pick, but I still like Ashley a lot. I feel like she gave a lot of strong answers, and it's for that reason that she's here at number 2. And now at number 1, my winner pick going into Big Brother 27 is Morgan. And Morgan's an interesting prospect here, where I feel like there's definitely some things to like about Morgan in the sense that she's seemingly well-rounded, where I feel like she's pretty good socially, where she does give off a lot of good energy in her interview. But even beyond that, like she is like pretty athletic, where she is a former D1 athlete, and I feel like she'll be pretty good at hiding that. Where she does talk about how like, she wants to hold back early on competitions and not win everything. And admittedly, strategically is probably her shortcoming, where she does admit she's not a super fan, where she did like watch the show with her mom, but wasn't that big of a fan compared to Ashley, for instance. So I did hesitate a little bit with that aspect to it. And beyond that, she also admits to being an empath and could be open to manipulation, which to be fair, most people do cite like being too trusting as like one of their weaknesses, though is still worth mentioning here with Morgan, though again, I feel like there's definitely some issues to be had with Morgan. But at the end of the day, I feel like her like strengths when it comes physically and socially are pretty strong on their own. I wouldn't expect her to be that big of a target right off the bat. And I think she's also in the perfect age group as well, where she is 33, where again, she's definitely on the older side of things, but I feel like she's kind of in that perfect middle ground where she is young enough to connect with the rest of the cast in their 20s, but still close enough to like the older people and Will and Amy to where she could connect with them as well. So I feel like it's for those reasons that I'm feeling pretty confident about Morgan as well. So I feel like it was pretty close between Morgan and Ashley, but I feel like it's those little things that nudge her ahead to me, which is why she is my winner pick for Big Brother 27. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. Now we'll be back again next week once the season has actually started, where we'll actually compare like what is happening to these people to what I think of them now. And I'm sure there'll be some differences there, but that's just how the way things are. And then beyond that, I will be live streaming the live shows during the season, so be on the lookout for that as well. I also have a Patreon and a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.